I have spent most of my life watching people make the same mistake with more sophistication each year. When they are young, the mistake is easy to understand. They think money solves every problem because they do not yet have enough of it, so they give their time to work. And that trade is rational. They have strength, they have runway, and they have years ahead to recover from errors. In that season, trading time for money the strange part comes later. I have watched men and women build a lifetime of discipline, save diligently, avoid foolish debt, invest patiently, and finally arrive at the point they once dreamed about. Their portfolio is large enough, their house is paid off or close to it, their spending is manageable, their children are grown. The arithmetic says they have won. And then they keep going, not because they truly need to, not because the plan demands it, not because another 5 years will transform a bad future into a good one. They keep going because somewhere along the way they learned to fear drawing down what they spent decades building. They stare at an account balance as if touching it is a moral failure. They have trained themselves to admire accumulation so deeply that they no longer recognize the moment when accumulation should begin serving life instead of replacing it. That is where many intelligent people lose the plot. The purpose of wealth is not to die with a very flattering spreadsheet. The purpose of wealth is to purchase freedom, while freedom can still be enjoyed. If money cannot buy back a morning when your knees still work, an afternoon when your mind is sharp, or a trip when you still have the energy to walk the streets instead of watching from the hotel chair, then those years are worth more than the extra digits you delayed your life to collect. I want to talk plainly about that point because most people do not need more slogans. They need an honest frame. And the frame is this: after a certain age, continuing to work often stops being a wealth decision and becomes a life trade that grows more expensive every year. Many people feel that shift somewhere around the late 50s. In practical terms, age 59.5 matters for a reason the tax code understands better than human psychology does. Before that point, several retirement accounts are more difficult and more expensive to tap. After that point, the early withdrawal penalty on many of those accounts disappears. The gate opens. Capital that once came with a penalty now becomes available without that extra tax punishment. It is not the only factor in retirement, but it is a real threshold. It changes flexibility. It changes optionality. It changes the conversation from theoretical freedom to usable freedom. But the legal threshold is only the surface issue. The deeper issue is that time, health, and energy do not move in a straight line. They do not stay politely constant while your account balance climbs. A lot of people behave as if they do. They imagine that if they feel fine at 56, then of course they will still feel basically the same at 63, 68, maybe even 75. I would like that to be true for everyone. It is not. Aging does not always announce itself slowly. Sometimes it arrives in bunches. You can go years feeling more or less the same, and then discover that the margin has narrowed. Recovery takes longer. Sleep matters more. Small injuries interrupt bigger plans. Long flights become tiring. A demanding hike that once sounded exciting starts to sound negotiable. The grandkids still want to run. Your body votes against it. The vacation is still possible, but not with the same appetite. The mind remains yours, but the stamina is different. The calendar did not look dangerous while you were filling it with meetings. Then one day you realize what you really spent. That is why I dislike the way many people talk about retirement. They discuss it as if it were a pure money question. It is not. It is a resource allocation question. Money is only one resource. Time is a resource. Health is a resource. Energy is a resource. Attention is a resource. Freedom is a resource. If you optimize one while silently burning the others, you may win the game on paper and lose it in real life. Early in adulthood, most of us have plenty of time and plenty of physical capacity, but very little money. So we sensibly convert the first two into the third. That is, the bargain: you work, you save, you invest, you delay gratification. There is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is usually necessary. But later, after enough has already been accumulated, the trade reverses. Once the money is sufficient, continuing to exchange prime years for more capital becomes a weaker bargain, yet people continue doing it out of habit. They say they are being prudent. Sometimes they are only being obedient to an old identity. They cannot separate the discipline that built the fortune from the discipline required to enjoy it well. Those are not always the same discipline. At this point, someone usually says, "I understand the principle, but what if I am taking too much risk by stopping? What if the market is ugly? What if inflation remains stubborn? What if rates fall? What if rates rise? What if politics changes? What if this is the wrong year?" That line of thinking sounds sophisticated because it borrows the language of macroeconomics. In practice, it often becomes a respectable costume for fear. A sound retirement is not built on guessing next year's headlines. It is built on durable principles. A sensible portfolio, a margin of safety, spending flexibility, tax awareness, enough liquidity to avoid forced selling at a bad moment, reasonable expectations, a willingness to make small adjustments rather than dramatic ones. When those elements are in place, you do not need a perfect climate. You need a plan robust enough to survive imperfect weather. People often overestimate the importance of the current financial environment because present conditions are vivid. What is vivid feels decisive. Bond yields are high, so they want to wait. Stocks are down, so they want to wait. Stocks are up, so they want one more year. Inflation is up, so they want to wait. Inflation cools, so they convince themselves one more bonus would make the transition cleaner. There is always a reason to wait if your real problem is emotional permission. And that leads to the most expensive misunderstanding in retirement planning. For decades, many people have anchored on a spending framework so conservative that it quietly steals years from them. I am referring to the famous 4% rule. The original idea has merit as a piece of historical analysis. It gave people a useful starting point, but a starting point is not a commandment, and many households have turned it into one. They hear 4% and immediately convert their retirement into a giant target number. Spend $100,000 a year. Then I need $2.5 million beyond Social Security. Need $60,000 from my portfolio. Then I need $1.5 million. The arithmetic is simple enough that it feels sacred. The trouble begins when people assume that, because the formula is easy, the decision must also be easy. Spending is not fixed like machine output. Retirees are not robots. Markets do not move in one direction forever. Households adjust, trips get postponed, big expenses cluster and then disappear. Dividends rise over time in many businesses, Social Security starts, taxes shift. Housing changes, medical costs vary. People spend more in some seasons and less in others. Above all, retirees make choices. They are not passive passengers locked into one spending setting for 30 years. A rigid interpretation of the 4% rule often ignores that adaptability. It treats retirement almost like an aerospace problem where every possible failure must be prevented at the highest cost. That mindset is understandable if you are designing equipment that cannot fail. It is much less sensible if the price of near-perfect certainty is sacrificing 5 or 6 healthy years that can never be repurchased. Suppose a household could retire not only at a 4% starting withdrawal, but at 5 or 5.5, or with a flexible guardrail approach that allows modest spending changes depending on market conditions. The difference between those frameworks is not just numerical, it is human. It may represent the ability to leave at 59.5 instead of 65. It may represent 5 more spring seasons in which your legs still want to move, your spouse still wants to travel, your grandchildren still think you can do everything, and your mind still has the crispness to experience rather than merely observe. People hear percentage points and think they are discussing abstract finance. They are not. They are discussing summers. They are discussing family dinners that happen before illness enters the room. They are discussing mornings in a foreign city before walking becomes a negotiation. They are discussing the years in which retirement still feels like expansion rather than recovery. I have never been impressed by financial plans that maximize numerical leftovers at the cost of lived life. If 2/3 of the time a retiree ends up with far more wealth than they began with, even after spending all those years, then the question is not whether caution is wise. Of course, caution is wise. The question is whether your caution has exceeded usefulness and become wasteful in a subtler form. Waste is not only overspending, waste can also be underliving. That idea makes some people uncomfortable because they mistake it for recklessness. It is not reckless to recognize that excess conservatism has a price. It simply means every form of safety must be measured against what it costs to buy it. I would rather think clearly about that trade than hide behind a slogan. And this is where another invisible force enters the picture. Many people delay retirement for reasons that have almost nothing to do with money. They tell themselves the issue is the portfolio. But when you pull on the thread, the real problem, work gave them structure. Work gave them status. Work gave them a scoreboard. Work answered the question, what do you do, in a way that felt respectable? Once that answer disappears, a quieter fear emerges. Who am I when the meetings stop? What will I do on Tuesday morning? Will I still matter if no one needs a decision from me by noon? That is not a silly fear. It is a serious one. A person can be financially prepared and psychologically unprepared. In fact, that combination is common. I have seen people with enough money continue working because work solved emotional problems they had not named. The office organized their day. Their title organized their self-respect. Retirement felt less like freedom and more like falling out of a moving car. The solution is not to dismiss the fear. The solution is to plan for the life that replaces the job. A good retirement plan should not stop at income projections. It should ask what fills your days, what responsibilities remain by choice rather than obligation, which relationships deepen when work no longer eats your attention, what pursuits restore energy instead of draining it. Whether you want to mentor, volunteer, build, read, teach, travel, care for family, or simply wake up without surrendering your best hours to an organization that no longer needs them as much as your own life does. A person who retires away from something often struggles. A person who retires towards something usually does better. That difference matters more than many spreadsheets acknowledge. And let me say something else that often gets lost. The point of retiring earlier is not to abandon discipline. It is to redirect it. You still need a structure. You still need healthy habits. You still need to know your spending. You still need a plan for health care, especially before Medicare age. You still need tax planning. You still need investment discipline. You still need a sensible withdrawal system. You still need to monitor and adjust. Freedom works best when it has intelligent boundaries. What you do not need is to stay chained to a desk out of reflex. A lot of people tell themselves, I will just work a couple more years and build a little more cushion. That sounds harmless. Sometimes it is harmless. Sometimes it is catastrophically expensive in ways that accounting statements never record. A couple more years can become 4 can become 7. During that time, the body changes. A spouse's health changes. Parents age out. Grandchildren move through stages that never repeat. Friends receive diagnoses. Your own enthusiasm narrows without warning. The life you plan to live after work does not always remain frozen in perfect condition while you finish maximizing the cushion. People assume the opportunity will wait because the calendar looks generous from a distance. Then distance vanishes. I have heard many retirees say they wish they had left sooner. I have heard very few say they ruined their lives by claiming back a handful of healthy years after they were already financially ready. That does not mean everyone should leave at the same age. It does not mean every household can leave in the late 50s. It does not mean you ignore your obligations. I am not arguing for fantasy. I am arguing for precision. Stop asking a vague question like, could I make more if I keep working? Of course you could. Ask the real question instead, what exactly am I buying with those extra years? And is it worth the years themselves? That question changes the entire conversation. If the answer is that another year of work secures genuine safety for a vulnerable spouse, fills a serious gap in healthcare coverage, eliminates expensive debt, or corrects a weak plan, then the year may be well spent. But if the answer is that the extra years mostly produce a larger number, greater emotional comfort, and the illusion of perfect certainty, then you may be paying for that comfort with the most valuable capital you own. The arithmetic of retirement should therefore be wider than the account statement. First, establish financial sufficiency honestly, not emotionally. Honestly, separate wants from needs. Estimate spending with rigor. Include taxes, include health care, include housing, include infrequent but real costs. Consider Social Security timing. Consider pensions if any exist. Consider multiple market paths, not only rosy ones. Build in flexibility, stress test the plan. Create ranges instead of pretending life obeys one exact. Second, examine access to capital. This is where age 59 and a half deserves practical respect. Once the penalty barrier falls for many retirement accounts, your resources become more usable. Liquidity planning gets simpler. The bridge from work income to retirement income becomes easier to design. That does not make the decision automatic, but it does remove one major source of friction. Third, design a withdrawal approach that behaves like a living system, not a frozen commandment. Static formulas are appealing because they are simple. Real life is not simple. A better approach acknowledges that spending can move within guardrails, that markets change, that households change, and that discipline is not the same thing as rigidity. Fourth, prepare the non-financial side with equal seriousness. If you do not know what your days are for, you will be tempted to return to the familiar machine that consumed them. Purpose does not always arrive automatically once the badge stops working. You may need to build it. That is not a weakness. It is part of the job. Fifth, protect health before and after leaving work. There is no grand retirement if the body is neglected. Movement, sleep, food, relationships, and stress management matter before retirement and after it. Too many people imagine they will become healthier once they stop working, while simultaneously using work as an excuse to postpone every habit that health requires. Sixth, understand that confidence rarely arrives all at once. Some people expect retirement to feel emotionally obvious the day the numbers work. Often it does not. Often it feels ambiguous because human beings are not spreadsheets. Waiting for perfect emotional certainty can keep you at work indefinitely. Better to seek reasonable clarity than impossible comfort. That is how I would think about the matter if I wanted to avoid the two classic errors at once. One error is retiring too early with no real plan and discovering that anxiety follows you into every room. The other error is postponing too long because you worship certainty and waking up to find that the years you were trying to protect are the same years you quietly spent. Between those errors lies wisdom. Wisdom says money is a tool, not a monument. Wisdom says an account balance is not the same thing as a life. Wisdom says freedom should arrive before the body begins negotiating every simple pleasure. Wisdom says the youth of your senior years are not a phrase. They are a vanishing asset. I have always believed that intelligent investing is ultimately about the intelligent use of time. Compounding works because time works. Patience works because time works. Experience works because time works. Nearly everything admirable in capital allocation depends on respecting the value of time. It would be strange indeed to honor time so faithfully while building wealth and then dishonor it the moment wealth has finally purchased the right to reclaim it. That is why I think so many people misunderstand the finish line. They imagine the finish line is the point at which every uncertainty has been eliminated. But life does not offer such a finish line. There is no age at which risk disappears. There is no portfolio large enough to make mortality irrelevant. There is no level of surplus that guarantees your favorite people will remain healthy, nearby, and available at your convenience. There is no account statement that can restore the years surrendered to hesitation. The real finish line is simpler. It is the point at which your resources can reasonably support the life you want. Your access to those resources is workable. Your plan can withstand bad weather without collapsing. And the next years of life are worth more to you than the incremental dollars your labor would add. Once you are there, the burden of proof should change. Instead of forcing yourself to justify retirement, force yourself to justify the continued sale of your remaining healthy years. That is a harder question. It should be. If your answer is still strong, continue with intention. But if your answer sounds vague, fearful, or inherited from habits that no longer serve you, then have the courage to admit what is happening. You may not be protecting your future. You may be postponing your life. and postponement has a hidden tax. It is not collected by the government. It is collected by biology, collected by changing energy, collected by opportunities that do not repeat, collected by the simple fact that the people you love are aging on the same clock. A great many fortunes are built by understanding opportunity cost in business. Curiously, many of the same people forget opportunity cost when it comes to their own remaining years. They measure the gain from another year of salary and neglect the cost of another year unavailable for living. That is not disciplined. That is incomplete accounting. Complete accounting asks a better question. How much is enough for a life you can still fully inhabit? If your answer is honest, and your plan is solid, and your fear is no longer pretending to be analysis, you may find that enough arrived earlier than you expected. At that point, do not confuse motion with progress. Do not confuse habit with prudence. Do not confuse more with better. Use your money for what it was always meant to do. Let it buy back your mornings. Let it buy back your attention. Let it buy back your health decisions, your family time, your curiosity, your travel, your rest, your chance to be present, while presence still has vitality in it. Because in the end, no one wins by preserving all the capital and missing the season in which the capital was supposed to be spent. A bigger pile is not the goal. A fully lived life claimed at the right time is the goal, and for many people standing near the late 50s, especially once the barriers around retirement assets begin to loosen, that right time is not someday. It is much closer than fear would like them to believe.